Prabha Khosla. Her talk title is Gender Equality and Social Inclusion in Municipal Policies and Services. In addition to the bio that is listed in your program, I just want to highlight that Prabha works with UN Habitat, has some really important chapters in a new book called Building Inclusive Cities that came out last year that I would encourage you to take a look at. So thank you, Prabha.
Good afternoon. I would like to acknowledge and thank our presence on the unceded lands of the coastal Salish peoples. I also, before I begin, want to thank the many women and the many hours that they have spent from Women Transforming Cities in organizing this conference and actually getting us all here today. I also want to thank them for putting the many concerns and priorities of diverse women and girls and gender equality in Canadian cities on center stage. I don't think we've had a moment like this, at least in my memory, and I've been working around women's rights in cities for many years. And I think it's really amazing that we're all here today talking about what we are talking about, which are concerns about women and girls in cities. I'm going to speak a bit to the need for a diversity and gender analysis in cities. I'm going to step back and take a slightly bigger sort of canvas. I'm going to talk to urban planning, and I'm going to talk to also Toronto in terms of diversity and poverty. And then to conclude, I will actually give some examples of some other institutions and the city that are putting gender equality on center stage. Now, as you all know, we live in patriarchal societies, not just historically, even today. So the reason I want to say this is because our cities are not gender neutral. They have been constructed by the value systems and the divides that patriarchy has created. And so if you look at how women and girls have been disadvantaged by patriarchy, our cities in how they've been constructed, how they've been planned, have also disadvantaged us. And I think a lot of the speakers in the sessions earlier and Sylvia and the people this morning have actually mentioned what some of the exclusion and disadvantage looks like. But in terms of urban planning, I want to talk a bit about, and I think a lot of you know, like in the early planning of cities, and what we did is the cities were designed by men for men. So it was able-bodied, childless men, and how they went to work and how they came home. It was not about women's journeys to work. We were seen as, working in the home, in the private sphere. Men work outside the home, in the public sphere. So all those divisions, which are false dichotomies, because women have always worked outside the home, women do have the right to public space, but they have actually shaped a lot of what urban planning became in terms of planning our cities. So my argument is the need for local governments to focus on what is women's day-to-day living, where the majority of women do so-called work in the home, in what I call the care economy, and that as part of a local government, they have a mandate and a responsibility to the public good also being half of who lives in cities, which is women and girls. So I'm a planner, so my interest is more in looking at urban planning, but I just want to underline how much urban planning shapes how each of us live. It shapes sort of density, it shapes the space of cities, it shapes where transit go or does not go, where condos go up and they do not go up, what kind of recreational services we get or we don't. And I did a quick review of the City of Toronto's official plan, the online version. I tried to see what they said about women. Well, surprisingly, the official plan does not mention women once. Neither does it mention First Nations or Aboriginal peoples. It does mention people with disabilities and seniors, but it does not distinguish that men with disabilities and women with disabilities have different realities and needs. and that older men and older women also have different priorities in cities. So they're mentioned in very gender-neutral terms. To me, what this says is that really women are missing from shaping the city and defining its priorities. And I'm sure Toronto is not the only municipality in Canada where women are missing from the official plan. I think that's probably true in many other Canadian cities and towns. However, what we do know is that women are organizing and mobilizing on a day-to-day living to change our cities, to make our cities work for us. So in spite of the non-existence and the disappearance from the official plan, we do know that we are part of what is making cities work better, function better. It's just that we are often not represented in the official power structures. And those are, again, patriarchally driven, and those are some of the structures we do need to change. Okay, the other thing I want to talk about is sort of poverty and the growing inequality in Canada. I think that we all hear about it, we know about it, and many of us live it. And to me, this is really part of the bigger picture of how neoliberalism is influencing Canada. I look at the various crises of capitalism, the financial meltdown. I look at what I feel is a very misled austerity agenda at the municipal and federal levels. And to me, all of those kinds of things are fueling the poverty in Canadian cities and the disparity and inequality. I feel obviously local governments have a role to also address this. So I will speak to Toronto because it's where I live, but in Toronto over the last, I would say at least 10 years, there's been numerous studies that have been released that look at poverty. So for example, there was an earlier one called Poverty by Postal Code by United Way. There was a second version looking at vertical poverty, 3 cities in Toronto, income disparity. So there's been a few. And I would say the vast majority do not disaggregate data by sex. So, for me, this is very disturbing. So we are saying, and they're all saying, okay, all these reports, that there is a growing poverty in racialized communities. Not all racialized communities are new immigrants. There is growing poverty in more recent immigrants to Canada. But if we do not say who are these people, then we don't really know, right? So the language, again, is very gender neutral. They talk about low and support parents. Well, I'm sorry, it's not okay. There are men who are raising children on their own, and I'm not saying that they are not. But we know that the vast majority of that are women-headed households. So we need to say, who is it that's becoming poorer? And really, none of these studies have. The only study, which is a recent one from February this year, which looks at, it's More Than Poverty, Employment, Precarity, and Household Wellbeing by PepsiCo and McMaster University, and also United Way. They are really the first major study that is disaggregating data, and they're also looking at the Hamilton and the Greater Toronto region together. So again, my concern is I do not understand why is 52% of the population not a variable worthy of analysis. I think this is really problematic, and I'm going to tell you a bit more where this goes and how it is. So, for example, in Toronto now, and I don't know if you know what the data looks like, but I would say more than half of Toronto lives in poverty of various sorts. And then there's a definition of what is that poverty. To me, that is just shocking. That in a city in Canada, we have such fantastic numbers of who lives in poverty. Okay, and it is clear that it is racialized. But part of what's happening also is the changing nature of work. There are so many more women working, we all know that, Stats Canada is telling us that, but what are we doing for work? Many women cannot get a 40-hour work week. The minimum wage is like 10 or 10.25. So many women are working two or three part-time jobs. So there is a question of what's happening to children, how are we making ends meet, and to me it's like, I actually had to think for this paper, that is it better for women to stay on social assistance? Because then you will at least get some daycare subsidy or medical subsidy or some help and support. But if women are going out there to work for $10 an hour, you are just going deeper into poverty. we are not changing women's lives. And for me, I think that local governments are responsible to these issues. Look, we have to engage and say what is happening to the nature of work. What is happening to the level of precarious work in Canada? Like, what is going on? The weakening of labor laws, the loss of union density, and these things impact women because unions have been very important in fighting for women's rights and changing the poverty level wages and having a working week. So I feel like, okay, so there is a growing poverty, but it's tied to this larger political and economic picture. Now, the reason I'm mentioning all of this is because the City of Toronto staff were involved in most of these studies. If the City of Toronto had a more gender-sensitive approach to itself, to how, to its mandates, its staff would have been educated on the need for more, a more aware lens. So what do? They did not raise the issue with any of these researchers that to have sex disaggregated data is a very critical thing. And why is all this important? Because these reports do impact Toronto and affect its policies. In the end, it's the City of Toronto is looking at that data and they're going to say, well, are we going to do something about it? And if we are, what are we going to do and how are we going to do it? So, if we do not know, right, who is poor in Toronto and how, because it's such a diverse city, Black women's poverty and how come they're poor and why they're poor is not necessarily the same as the First Nations women or Tamil women or Somali women. If we do not know how and why is it that women are poor, we cannot get rid of the poverty. We cannot reduce it. We will not know what's the best way to spend the money and what are the best kind of programs we need. So again, we need to have a diversity and a gender analysis so that we can start to see how do we reduce poverty in cities. But the other thing is, I also want us to make a link between things in Toronto like young Black men getting shot and killed. So what do? We go out there and we hire more police and then we build more basketball courts for Black men. Like, how come we're not talking about the mothers and the grandmothers of these boys? They belong to somebody. They're not a random factor out there called young Black men. No, really. So, it's like maybe we need to stop and see. We need to see what does it mean. Maybe we need to understand racism better. We need to understand exclusion better. These are many of them are Canadian born. So that's what I'm saying. The poverty is not only in terms of new immigrants. Anyway, so you get where I'm going with that. I just feel like we really need to stop and say, what is it that we are losing and what are the impacts of not having that analysis at a municipal level? But the other side of this is, I also want to look a bit at housing, because I feel it's a fundamental need for everybody, but women. And I want to talk a bit about that local governments can actually change things. There's a lot we can do as both municipal governments, but also that there's a wealth of knowledge and creativity in all of you. There's amazing women's civil society, there's amazing all kinds of civil society in Canadian cities, and they are part of the solution. And cities, I don't feel, tap into the wealth of the citizens. They really don't, and that is a really big, fantastic loss. So I feel so I'm just going to raise some of the issues that I think we need to change so that the cities are slightly better for women. I think the whole issue of housing, affordable housing, appropriate housing, there was a really good panel that I was a part of this morning, and thank you to all the people who spoke there. We need to have women involved in the design of neighborhoods. Suburbs are not the best way for anyone to live. The idea of isolating women in these so-called nuclear families out there by themselves is really unhealthy. If we had a different notion of urban planning, if we let women plan cities and residential neighborhoods, we wouldn't do these little, row after row up, and in this really sort of stark and sterile neighborhoods. We need to plan where women's day-to-day living, where childcare comes together with the kind of unpaid work women do. How do women do all the other things that women do in homes, right? All the women who are cooking and selling food, or they teach music, or they're baking, or they do tailoring. There's a lot of work that women do to not be so poor. So if we were to design residential areas that are mixed use, that have transit, where we combine childcare, we have some kind of economic incubators. We support the work women do in the home to actually leverage it a little bit out, so that instead of making $30 a week, you could make $16 more a week. I think the city has a role to change the economic departments of municipalities. We have to look at what is women's poverty. We have to look at how can the city's economic departments support women and empower women economically. I think that's a really important local government mandate. We can look at improving women's skills. We can look at how cities can support micro, medium, or small enterprises. I really think we need to start looking at childcare centers as possibly a 24-hour service. I think there's a lot of women in shift work. There's a lot of men in shift work, and with the nature of the changing economy, I think we need to think differently. We need other kinds of options. What else? I also think that the provision of social services or recreational services is really important to women, to raising families, and to children and young men and women. And these should be free services. That, these are some of the kinds of things that can assist women's domestic burdens, and local governments are accountable to reducing women's domestic burdens. Okay, so just to conclude, I'm going to give you a few examples of some other institutions that do gender equality and diversity work. I particularly like Vienna, Austria, and some of you might have heard me talk about Vienna before. They began their notion of gender mainstreaming in the early 1990s. And I kind of like their approach because what they did is each municipal department had to do a pilot project, and they had to develop their own guidelines for gender mainstreaming. And it was a very it was a very conscious project. Everybody's watching, we're learning, and then we change and as we go on. And as we get better, it then starts to incorporate policy and change the entire department. So they have done work that looks at gender, age, and social and cultural backgrounds together. And they've done a lot in the domain of design of public spaces. So they've changed the notion of pavements and pathways. They have put a lot more lighting in the city, and it's not random, yeah? It's very, very deliberate. They have more road crossings, and through this whole process, they've actually changed planning and norms, and they've changed the notion of official plans. They have gender responsive budgeting in their municipal departments. They have redesigned cemeteries because they feel that, and they have done the research, that the people who visit the most are older women. So what do we do to redesign cemeteries is we put more benches, we make sure that the pathways are smoothed over so you can have a mobility device, so you can have a wheelchair. They've brought in more taps at a lower level, and there's better signage and safer washrooms. And then they have developed a public campaign to educate citizens about gender mainstreaming and gender equality in a municipal level. And that's been really fascinating because they have these very trippy posters, and they do a whole sort of changing of roles of the gender division of labor. So they have a lot of pictures of, with men with babies, and they have women doing manual work, and all of that. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to talk a bit about the Asian Development Bank, which is a bank. And they have, as a bank, they have pro-poor gender equality conditionalities on almost 40% of their loans and many of their grants. And these are loans and grants for large urban infrastructure projects. So it's roads, it's bridges, it's public transport, it's water, it's sewage, it's all of those things. And I want to talk about the UK, which by law requires that local governments have to have gender equality and anti-racist action plans. And that is, again, it's a way to start to address exclusion and discrimination in society. Okay. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you so much, Prabha. We have a very short time for a couple of questions. I'm going to apologize in advance. We're not going to have time for all the questions that you want to ask because our next session actually starts at 2 o'clock, even though this session ends at 2 o'clock. So if you don't get a chance to ask your questions, please do so at the break at 3:30. So I'll shut up. Anyone want to ask a question? Yeah, Mary.
Thank you very much for those talks. My question is for Prabha. I so appreciated your point that work is a significant factor in what's happening in the cities. And I think if I hear one more politician talk about creating jobs instead of asking what the important jobs are, I think I might be sick. But if you could identify, I've heard you naming practices within planning that will alter environments, but how would you interject into that sort of creation of ways of organizing our labor that are actually driving in useless directions, right? There are sort of 3 or 4 things that you'd like to see in terms of focusing our labor in alternate directions. Could you rephrase that? 3 or 4 ways, what were you of focusing labor in ways that will alter our cities toward equity?
Towards equity. I mean, I don't know it in the broad sense. I think that we have to make, all kinds of jobs open to men and women. Now, I'll give you a quick example. When the federal government did their, whatever the works project, there was no effort made to say that those construction jobs, road building jobs, sewage jobs should be equally for men and women, that they should be 50-50 hiring. Who says women can't do any of those jobs? Okay? But I just am at the point where we just put the foot down and say, you have to have equity in hiring. Because that question was never ever raised. So I don't care where they were in the world, and they were also supposed to be infrastructure projects, but that was never ever done. So I think some explicit defining of that. In terms of this precarious work stuff, I think local governments, even as individual human beings, have to get up and challenge our provincial governments about labor laws. Mm-hmm. What kind of licensing are we doing with temp agencies? What is going on? Is this a Canada we want, where everybody has a part-time permanent job of 25 hours a week? Well, I mean, what is this? So I know that the policies come from different levels of government, but that doesn't mean we have to stop and just say, well, I'm just at the municipal level, so that's a provincial thing and I can't get involved.
Right on.
I think we have to say it's unacceptable. And it's impacting the citizens of my city if I'm the elected official. And I don't want to have a city of only poor people, or rather people who are getting poorer every minute. No, I think municipal people have to get up and say, we disagree with your provincial policies. Sorry, I don't have all the answers to that.